Hey, CNFers, this episode sponsored by Liquid IV. It's a better Gatorade. They probably don't like it that I would even say that in the same sentence, but it's true. And I gotta say, this is delicious. Great way to rehydrate and fuel those endurance activities, or if you just want to zhuzh up your water. As some of you know, I'm training for the unsanctioned Mackenzie Marathon. It's not going very good, and Liquid IV is in my bottle, not because of Liquid IV. It's some tasty stuff. Been a big fan of the lemon lime, non-GMO, free from gluten, dairy, and soy, so you know your burly vegan digs it. Get 20% off when you go to liquidiv.com. Use the promo code CNF at checkout. That's 20% off anything you order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code CNF at liquidiv.com. Oh, and by the way, it's an affiliate thing, so I get no money unless you buy stuff. So buy stuff. I like the sound of that.
What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in our atmosphere stays in our atmosphere.
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's CNF Pod, that creative nonfiction podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Yes. It's a fitting time of year to talk about this book with this author, John Vaillant, at John Vaillant on Twitter. And you're spelling Vaillant, Vaillant. Got it? Don't ask. Just do it. Fireweather. A true story from a hotter world. It's published by Knopf. John is a journalist based out of Western Canada, and he's also the author of The Tiger, The Golden Spruce, and The Jaguar's Children. Little sidebar. Just by the nature of the show, I don't have a whole lot of time to read outside of the reading I do for the show. But if I did, I'd want to read a person's body of work. You know, the way you might watch several movies to see a through line of a favorite director or a director who inspires you. At least with that, you can watch a few movies in a day if you were so motivated. To read even John's books would take you at minimum, at least for me at minimum, a full month. Minimum, probably longer. I read pretty slow and I'm okay with that. I see some people on Instagram and it's like June 1st and they're like, book 51 of the year. And I'm like, eat shit, asshole. We're all real impressed. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. Make sure you're heading over to brendano'mara.com for show notes and to sign up for the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Just click the lightning bolt on my website or visit rageagainstthealgorithm.substack.com. There could be some serious bonus stuff coming down the pipe. Maybe, probably not, but maybe. First of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat it. If you dig the show, you consider sharing it with your networks, wherever your networks hang, so we can grow the pie and get the CNF thing into the brains of other CNFers who need the juice. And don't we all need the juice? You can also leave a kind review on Apple Podcasts. It's a free way to support the show, so the wayward CNFer might say, shit, I'll give that a shot. And a non-free way to support the show, which makes me kind of happy. It might make you happy too. Patreon.com/CNFpod. You can drop a few bucks in the hat if you glean some value. Show is free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. And I started doing some one-on-ones as a little bonus for people in the Patreon gang. Any tier might offer something a bit more saucy for the upper tiers. But I did this thing. I just wanted to throw a bone out there. And it's not going to be a regular thing, or maybe twice yearly. I guess that's regular. But I threw it out there, and a chunk of patrons, maybe 25% of the whole pot, are getting to talk some things out with me. Sometimes that's all you need, right? All right, I'm going to close that spigot off soon. So if you're in the Patreon gang, sign up before I shut it off. And if you're not a patron, patreon.com/CNFpod. If you're wondering where the shout out to Athletic Brewing is, it's right here. My favorite non-alcoholic beer out there. Not a paid plug, but as some of you know by now, I'm a brand ambassador, and I want to celebrate this amazing product. If you go to athleticbrewing.com and use the promo code BrendanO20 at checkout, and use a referral link over in the show notes, you can get a nice little discount on your first order. I don't get any money, and they are not an official sponsor of the podcast. I just get points towards swag and beer. Give it a shot. So, John, you can tell he loves the work because we talk about getting into the nitty-gritty of interviewing, and interviewing with some heart. He gets that from his mom, and that's definitely where I get it from. My mom's superpower was making people feel comfortable talking. She's still kicking in the nursing home, about the same as ever, memory wise, but, wasting away as one does in their 80s in a wheelchair as their brain slowly turns to mashed potatoes. Well, anyway, John and I, we talk about interviewing for Scene, getting into someone's skin, and how Twitter actually helped John. And fire. Cue Beavis voice from Beavis and Butthead. Fire, fire, fire. Yeah, it's all here, CNFers. Riff. I love that quote from David Wallace Wells. Unfortunately, exquisitely timed.
Yeah, no, that it was uncanny. Yeah, planning that 7 years out took some doing.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, that's a great. I think that's a great jumping off point. Just the sheer fact of how long books of this nature is so deeply and intricately researched, and and then of course so well written that how you stick with it and endure, just the entire process and not get too bogged down by it. Of course, there are moments of getting bogged down, but when you're talking about a 7-year book project, how do you, I don't know, just stay in it and stay energetic for the work?
Ooh, Brendan, this was I thought about that every day, and this was a really different animal. Like the other books have been pretty much 3 years door to door, and really steady work and few breaks and just kind of plodding through it in an energetic way. And this was really different. And I think the Trump years had some impacts on that. The kind of the ominousness of and the implications of the project. What I was actually looking at, is so grave that it, I don't know if it slowed me down, but it really made me question what I was doing. I feel, I don't know if other writers you've interviewed have thought about this, but I feel like in a way to write almost requires a certain level of civilizational stability. You have to be able to sit quietly in a room and have some confidence that the world isn't going to burn down around you. And so it presupposes a certain base level of stability in the world. And when you look really closely at the climate file right now, even right now at this minute, you look at the fires burning, record fires in Canada, you look at record ocean temperatures off the coast of Ireland and elsewhere, we're in a moment, and we've never been here before. And so I was feeling that as I was writing, and really almost daily wrestling with myself. How can you rationalize sitting at a desk, opining and exploring and investigating when really you should be at the barricades? So that was a real quandary for me. And I think that slowed me down. There were a lot of days of just not writing. And so I think in some ways, this project, maintaining energy and momentum for this project, was slightly different than some other long projects that other writers may have undertaken. I've got a friend right now who's doing a definitive biography, and he's 7 or 8 years in, and he's still not done. And it's a long, complicated life he's trying to cover, and it's a really long haul. And so then you have the deadline, you have the kind of the ticking clock of the advance running out. Just in terms of the finances of how nonfiction works, at least in the U.S. and North America. So that's a factor. And then, it's a funny combination of tedium and anxiety. And then on top of that, you get these dopamine hits of discovery, when you find a new fact or make a new connection or get a new interview or figure out where a quote's going to drop in for maximum effect, or somebody on Twitter points you towards something amazing, which happened to me a lot. Twitter, honestly, was my research assistant for this book. And that was really a first. And that might be interesting to talk about at some point. it made me smarter, it made me wiser, and made me seem like more people than I am. And so I'm really grateful to it. But as far as maintaining that momentum over 7 years, you just get up and put your ass in the chair. And it's really, that's the main job, even in spite of all your doubts. And you have made a commitment to your publisher and also to yourself. Your family is out there kind of waiting for it to be done. And so there are a few, I think, very healthy social pressures kind of keeping you honest and keeping you on task. And then there is, in this case, too, complicating it further was just the dynamism of the subject. Between 2016, when I decided I wanted to write a book about modern fire and Fort McMurray and the terrible fire that burned through that city in May of 2016, so many things happened on the climate file. So many greater and even more terrible fires broke out in other parts of the world. And so many states, provinces, and nations had the worst fire season in their respective histories post 2016. And so I'm writing along. And when I was working on the tiger or working on the golden spruce, those stories stayed where you left them. You could put them down for a month and you go back to the notes, you go back to the narrative, nothing has changed. Here, you look away for a week and there's some new extreme that has been, or some new threshold that's been crossed or broken. There's some new climate lawsuit. There's some new information about a bank or an insurance company dropping some major petroleum project. And this was all relevant. And so, really, right now, ongoing is this period of an incredible cataclysmic epochal change in terms of how our civilization reckons with the powerful manifestations of climate change that are now besetting us from all sides.
Yeah, there's a moment very early in the book where when you're talking about the bitumen sands in Alberta and in Fort McMurray, where and it's a very hard petroleum to refine just based on its very nature. But there was something like that it was like $500 billion investment, and I was just like, oh my god. Here is this like a very labor intensive, resource intensive way to harvest this fossil fuel, whereas my goodness, what could $500 billion do if we were to just invest that in like the best solar or wind technology, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. When you think of the money and energy and most valuable, the time that we have squandered, really since the 1970s, when the climate writing really was already on the wall, when photovoltaics and wind power were in their infancy, but clearly viable. And we really lost almost fully 2 generations, and we're still melting tar out of subarctic sand. Our descendants will look back in amazement at our insanity, and it's really hard to wrap your head around that hydrocarbon recovery endeavor going on in northern Alberta that has been so front and center in Canada's economy and certainly Alberta's economy. And it's especially when you consider all the natural gas that is used to melt the bitumen.
Yeah.
And natural gas is really great energy on its own. Methane aside, um, greenhouse gases aside, it's already ready to burn, ready to go, ready to create energy for us. And so to squander that energy on melting tar out of quartzite sand 1,000 miles from the nearest market or tidewater is, it's really a stretch. And so to figure out the economics of that, the rationale behind that, why a G7 nation would waste its time, treasure, and reputation on that is, that's a big ask in and of itself. And that was just kind of one aspect of this book.
A moment ago, I loved what you said about the dopamine kick of occasionally finding that like that great little tidbit in your research just by virtue of like having the ass in the chair. And Yeah, I can attest that. Just the other day, my central figure died in 1975, and I'm starting. My deadline is so tight that I have to kind of write as I'm going at this point. And
Hmm.
I had this this moment. There's this high school track meet, blah blah blah. It's like it was had a little bit of detail, but not a whole lot. And then I read the story from 1975 when my guy died, and turns out like his who would be his future college coach, Bill Bowerman, was at a track meet, and he had never said he was at this particular track meet when Steve was a high school freshman. And he, in this sort of obituary piece, he's like, I remember seeing him at this meet, and I was just like, oh, that's so cool. Like, now I get to infuse this very early scene and plant him as a character at this particular meet when this kid was on the rise. Before, I never knew that. I'm like, oh my god, that's such a great little detail that I get to go back in time and put it there. And it's and I talking about that dopamine kick. It's like I just had one. And I was like, this is awesome.
I really feel you there, Brendan. And also, what you're doing is you're making a connection for everybody else. No one else probably cares enough, with respect, to make that connection. And yet, what you're doing is creating this structure of history. And by being able to place those names and place those events in time and space, and taking the care and time to do it that only an obsessive nonfictioneer will do, or a historian, you're really reassembling a lost world. And it's very possible that if you hadn't done that, that connection, that link, that moment would be lost to history. And it's so you're really kind of performing this service for the future, I feel. We are collectively,
Yeah.
by kind of assembling, and identifying these links. And it's really this web work of events and people and intersections of time and place. And I did that repeatedly in Fireweather, and it's really thrilling to do that. You're kind of re-peopling the world and events, and this thing that might have just been a symposium, when you can actually put the people there and realize, oh my gosh, this guy was there, and she was there, and he was there, and they've kind of gathered across space and time to make this new meaning. And that is, it's a kind of rarefied thrill that I think, historians and nonfictioneers and other types of researchers particularly enjoy, but that readers and people coming later to the story appreciate, even if it's unconscious. They can just see more. You get a richer sense of detail and depth. And that's what brings the story to life. All those connections, they're almost like synapses for the story.
Yeah. And then it comes, let's say, like baked into it is a kind of researching insecurity too, or an anxiety, in that like sometimes you're like, you can't turn every single page, you can't read it
Yeah,
all by yourself.
yeah,
And what are we
yeah.
missing? Like, I stumbled across some of those details. I'm like, oh my god, like what else might I be missing, like when I run out of time?
Oh, Brendan, I mean, I think that's everybody's fear in this game. And I mean, the kind of the corollary terror is not asking the right question. And
Yeah.
I, especially going into subjects, every subject that I research, I don't really know much about when I go into it. And I have my own, you know, basic curiosity about it, and I'll do some reading about it. But if you don't know to ask the right question, each question is like a key. And when you ask it, you're opening up a new box, and or a new safe, or some secret trove.
Yeah.
But if you don't ask that question, your subject may take it for granted that you know already, because it's second nature to them, but it's actually really interesting. And so, for example, in Fireweather, I had occasion to speak to bulldozer operators, and they, started telling me things about how you operate a bulldozer, and the way, how actually sensitive it is, despite the fact that it weighs 50 tons. You can feel incredible subtleties of terrain change through your seat. And they, offered that one up, but it wasn't something I would have thought to ask. And once I got that little trace of hint of information. Then I started probing more about the sensitivities of these giant machines, and they're really quite surgical. And it's such a contradiction when you see these things grinding by, along the side of a highway or something like that. It's they look like such blunt instruments, but really the people operating them are incredibly sensitized to every twitch and bump that they encounter. And I just love that kind of thing, because it enriches our understanding of something that we think we already understand. I mean, what's not to understand about a bulldozer? It pushes dirt around, but actually, they are almost like 50 or 100-ton bubble levels. Like, you can feel exactly how crooked or off center you are with incredible specificity. And I just never would have known that. And yet, these guys who are sitting there smoking, and their boots are untied and they look kind of unkempt, they're actually really tuned in.
Yeah, to that point, you write really well about almost the animalification of fire and how like alive it is. And there's a really good set piece like in the first third of the book or so, just where you really just talk about the science of the fire, but also just how like alive it is. And you really like kind of like changed it in my head about my perception of it. Here I am thinking the flame is just this mere erasure of heat, like a release of heat, but then it ends up being this breathing thing, and it's releasing different volatile gases within certain structures, and then it just feeds off that and pulls it towards it. And it's I imagine, just like the bulldozer anecdote, you were really learning about fire in a ways that you likely didn't know before.
Oh yeah, no, I really go in as an ignoramus, with some questions, and the more you burrow into it, and then I realize, wow, I really don't understand how this works. I'm really going to have to, basically apply myself with more vigor. And I'm a layperson. I'm not a science guy. I'm interested in science. I appreciate it. I appreciate it the same way I appreciate jazz music. I don't really understand what's going on, but I understand that those folks are geniuses, and it would behoove me to understand it better. And I feel the same way about chemists and physicists and climate scientists and meteorologists. They really have taken the time to master a really complex series of events and elements. And so be able to grasp that well enough to basically explain it back to my layperson self in a way that holds up takes a huge amount of time and effort, because you're really almost having to reverse engineer it. You have to break it all down in its technical terms and then reassemble it using similes and metaphors that someone like me could understand, but that still hold up for the science. And just I'm proud to say I just did a reading last night in Bellingham, Washington, and a chemistry teacher was there, and he came up to me afterward and he said, "I just want to tell you, your description of fire behavior and how it works was correct,
Oh, that's
and
great. Yeah.
uh, good for you." And he was impressed, and I was really relieved, because I'm way out of my comfort zone here. I'm cantilevered pretty far out on a lot of this, of the science, and I really made an effort to fact check it and get it right. And I ran it through, past fire scientists and some other experts. I do that, before I let it loose in the world. But still, there's that fear, of some detail that is obvious to an expert that is not obvious to me, that's going to, sneak through and end up, in the final version. And then you're just going to have to live with it. And the embarrassment of that, and I just don't want to be wrong. You're serving your readers, they're trusting you, they're investing money in the book, or at least time in it, by reading it, and you really don't want to betray that trust. So you really want to have it right, and so that chemistry teacher really put me at ease. I slept better last night.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great to hear, and that's sometimes the greatest compliment when you're dealing with some very nuanced and or even esoteric topics within, say, fire. and to know that you got it right with someone who is like deeply like steeped in the science of a thing, and meanwhile we are just kind of like tourists in it, and we're just trying our best to be good tour guides for the reader. And so when you stick the landing on something like that, it's like, whew, man, that does feel good. And yeah, you do sleep better that night.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that's really the greatest vindication for me. I don't know how it is for you, but when like if a firefighter reads fire weather, or a climate scientist read it, or an incident commander, or or somebody like that, um, that's really the highest praise, because you're reflecting their reality that they're experts in accurately back to them in a form that they can respect and recognize. And it's really hard to do. And um, that's really what I strive for. I mean, it's really a joy to be read, by anybody, frankly. But to have somebody who is, a legitimate expert in the subject that you've decided to take on is, it's kind of like winning a prize for me. It's really, um, it's just, it's a kind of ultimate validation, I guess, that really matters a lot to me.
Yeah, there are like so many tasty, so few tasty breadcrumbs along the way, and many opportunities and many off ramps for you to like question why you're doing this, and like, damn it, like, should I? You're writing a book, you're like, God damn it, like, this is the last one. There's no way I'm doing this again. But then, but then you get those little shots that stuff that puts fuel in your tank. You're like, oh, okay, that's part of the reason why I do this. And then you're just like drawn in. Then you're like Pacino in Godfather 3. It's like, it pulls me back in.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a very seductive medium, for those of us who have the bug, and it's I mean, I guess it, in a way, it's that when I think about what I write, I'm thinking about, well, I paint what I see, and these are the things happening in the world that compel me. But I think of a landscape painter kind of setting up outside, and how did you choose that horizon? How did you choose that time of day, that particular situation, and why do you want to then go out and basically recreate it? I think about that a lot in terms of creation with a capital C, and in terms of just the world as it is, warts and all. And as a nonfiction writer, you're trying to recreate that. So you are trying to paint what you see, and yet what's there already is perfect because it is. Like it exists. So regardless of how you feel about it, it's its own kind of perfection because it is manifesting on earth and at this particular moment. And so as a writer, as a renderer, I see our role as trying to rise to the level of creation, which is kind of the most audacious task. It's kind of like, son, your arm's too short to box with God. And that's, as a writer, trying to render something that already is at a level of detail that you could never match. The audacity of trying to do that, in a way, the foolhardiness of it, or the vanity of it, is something that strikes me on a regular basis, and yet it's totally compelling. It's really like it's this irresistible challenge.
I love what you say about like painting what you see, and so much of the challenge of narrative nonfiction is at times painting what you can't see. So
Mm-hmm.
what was the challenge for you when you weren't on the scene to still create vivid cinematic scenes despite you not being there to witness it?
That's a really good point. And when I wrote the proposal for this book, back in 2016, the fire had broken out, and it had burned through this city of 90,000 people, and caused historic damage. But I wasn't there. I was in another country actually at the time, and so as I wrote it and recreated some of the scenes, some of the moments, and one of my editors was reading the proposal. She thought that I'd been there. She said, "Oh, so you went up to Fort McMurray?" And I said, "No, I haven't been there yet." And, through, I mean, YouTube is really a boon in terms of being able to see, what you missed, but also, you don't have the smells, you don't have the visceral experience of being in it, and so to create that, to kind of make that what I would call an empathic leap into the scene, that requires this extra level of being able to kind of transpose your senses into that place and draw on everything that you know about fire, about the subarctic, about a suburban street, about a melted car. And you may not have experienced those precise things, but you have to kind of draw on a lifetime of experience. I've traveled a lot, I've done a lot of things, been a lot of places. And so I'm able to kind of patchwork together these sensory memories in a way that basically create a simulacrum of authenticity in that moment, even though I wasn't there. And so, I take the street name and the name of the town and the date, from the records that exist, and then after that you're kind of layering up the paint, if you will, over the canvas to get that sense of depth and authenticity of experience, so that then the reader coming along, there you've situated them in place and time, and then on top of that you're giving them this sensory experience. And that's where, the English language is, maybe unparalleled in terms of its versatility and energy and ability to convey nuances of sensation. It's really, really fantastic. I feel honestly incredibly lucky to be a native English speaker for that reason, because I feel like there's this just infinite colors at my fingertips, going back to the painting analogy, that you can kind of subtly and not so subtly shade the scene and really give it a kind of three-dimensional extrasensory pop.
Yeah, the in interviewing people for those sensory details, it can be just really it can be really awkward to ask those questions. And I know when I do it, it's where I'm like, all right, I know this is hard. I know it was a long time ago, but do you know the weather? Do you remember the smells? If I was running right behind you, what would I be seeing? And it's like it
Yeah,
feels
yeah,
weird,
yeah.
and they kind of you can feel them just kind of went like, I don't know, it was so long ago, blah 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 blah. But I think we
Mm.
got, we got to get over that. I wonder for you, just like how have you learned to just maybe, I don't know, get over that awkwardness, because in service of the story and those details, it ultimately makes for just a far better book.
Yeah, oh, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. And the most kind of egregious, extreme version of that for me was interviewing Yuri Trush for the Tiger. And so he was the Russian warden charged with hunting this man-eating tiger down. And it was a really desperate, it was kind of this kind of ultimate game of literally cat and mouse, except cat and man. And the the ending was not by no means a foregone conclusion about who would prevail. And I interrogated that poor man, and I had a Russian translator with me. And because he was a warden, because he was a lawman, he respected my basically obsession with detail. And so I was asking him what kind of socks he wore, what type of boots he wore, were they lace up, were they Velcro, what were they made out of? A lot about his firearms, about his clothes, about his vehicle, about the quality of the snow. And I literally went back to him every day for a week. So hours and hours each day. And we just kind of wore each other out. And to his credit, he stayed with it. But I think when people understand your motives, uh, that you are really trying to get it right, what you're basically doing is showing respect for their reality and for their experience. And so I think a lot of people respond positively to that. Once they trust you, it's like, wow, this guy really he cares as much as I do. Maybe he even cares more than I do. And that's kind of wonderful to have that kind of attention beamed on you, because most people really don't care what you think or what you say or what you did or what happened to you that day. And so to have somebody like us come in with a genuine intelligent interest and not, a parasitic manipulative interest.
Yeah.
And there's a whole ethical piece to being a reporter and an interviewer that we can get into, because there is this kind of mercenary aspect to it. And at the same time, when you're in it, when you're in that experience together, my mother told me that, the definition of charm is the ability to get people to talk about themselves. And so, that's something that I learned from my mother, and I'm good at it. And, by kind of leaning in and showing an intelligent interest and knowing just enough about the topic that you can ask a question that almost sounds like, oh, wow, you've done this too. And then you're sort of in the club then, and then they might give you kind of an extra layer of detail that you didn't know about. And so slowly you can kind of recreate the scene in incredible detail. And you can see that effort in the tiger, and you can see the patience of Yuri Trush, sitting with me day after day, working through moment by moment, move by move, this desperate hunt. And the same, with a foot race, or a boxing match. You want that level of detail, that literally blow by blow kind of granularity. And that, we'll all go there, as readers, as watchers, as fellow investigators and enjoyers of the human experience. We want that level of detail because we know what it feels like too. We can put ourselves there. And that's a real gift, I think, to the reader, to be able to kind of step into this other skin and inhabit it in a really vivid way. And there's just no other way to get that.
Yeah, the step into the skin. I love hearing you say that, because one of my favorite things, because I'm talking to a lot of elite athletes, and I preface the thing by saying, like, this might sound a little weird, but like, when things were going good, when your body was just in its prime, and you were having a prime day, like, what did that feel like? Where you're running down to the long jump pit. And asked this one woman, Fran Worthen, she was very, very, very good long jumper. She was just like, she almost was like, rolled her head back. She was just like, it was like I was flying. It was great. And to hear them articulate when their bodies were just so primed. How does the discus feel when it comes off your lead finger, when you've just spun 3 times and like that thing is going for a world record? Like, what is that like? I'm never going to experience that. What was that like? And you can see them really come alive, even on the phone when you're not even looking them in the eye. You feel the energy of like, wow, this person is really trying to get to the heart of my craft.
Oh, Brendan, I can just feel my own, interest, just because already you're describing things that I had never really thought about and certainly have never experienced. And yet we want to know what the extremes of the human experience are, and the lows and the highs, and to be an elite athlete, in her prime, with this kind of almost supernatural power where you're harnessing, the momentum, of the object with your own body, with your own skeleton, with the temperature of the air and the density of the air that day, and all getting it in sync for maximum effect. Only a kind of a genius can do that. I'm thinking of, these kind of, like a transcendent jazz solo or something like that. When someone is so fully in the zone that it's angelic. And, a normal person cannot do that. In fact, you as an elite athlete may not even be able to reproduce that.
Yeah.
So there was some synchrony in that moment that was perfect. And how amazing, to be a human being and experience it. And how amazing to be a writer and have the privilege and opportunity to convey that experience for the rest of us who are, schlumping around, in our sweatpants and slides.
Right. Well, that gets to the point of, and it's very fitting, a very fitting metaphor, so to speak, about interviewing and stuff, and seeing it as a sort of a renewable energy instead of an extraction industry. And
Mm,
and by, and
mm.
it can be viewed, with the ethical part that you were alluding to a moment ago, how interviewing can, you could treat it like scorched earth, just burrow down, take all the oil and move out of Boomtown, or you can really invest in
Yeah.
being like truly, truly enamored by their craft while still extracting information, but it is a more nourishing way of utilizing the time and the privilege it is to speak to that person.
Brendan, I really think that's a good point. And because I do think an interview well done elevates everybody. And the interviewer gets what they want. They get this material and this detail. But I mean, the older I get, the more I realize that pretty much 90% of what human beings want out of life is to be seen and heard. It's really simple.
Yeah.
And a good interview, the subject really feels seen and heard. You're really there attending to every detail and validating, this intense experience they had. And I went through this a lot with, in Fort McMurray. You're basically interviewing people about the worst, scariest, most devastating day of their lives. They saw their house burn down, or they, trying to escape this fire that, they literally don't know if they're going to live through it. And the kids are in the back seat. So it's a terrible thing to put a human being through, and then to put them through it again by saying, "So, tell me about it." And
Yeah.
I saw a lot of grown men cry in Fort McMurray, and that's a tough town. That's a hardworking, petroleum town, and that fire wounded a lot of people. And so to talk about it and create a space that's safe enough and trustworthy enough for them to kind of go through this trauma and feel some of it, in a fulsome emotional way, in a way that they don't, have to guard against or have to be strong for their kids. They can just know, I'm really weeping right now, and it's that can be, I think, a really healthy release for the person who experienced it, and it's a really, in that sense, I feel like, and I don't think I'm kidding myself here. I feel like you can really almost be doing a service. It's almost beyond just an interview. It's almost a potentially therapeutic, kind of intervention where you're creating a safe place to release some of the tension from that event. And, I really, experienced that a lot. And as I went back and checked back in with people, on upon publication of the book, saying, look, you remember that interview we did 5 years ago? Well, it's actually getting published now. And I just wanted to check in with you, about that. Are you still good with that and all this? And they had really good memories of our conversations and kind of wanted to fill in the gaps and, relive some of the things and talk about where they were now. And so it really, that ended up, I think, being a positive for them. And that really was reassuring to me and made me feel better about, essentially invading their privacy.
It really gets to the point where I think a lot of reporters and journalists can have are seen potentially as like vultures of just trying to like rake up all this information just for their own personal gain in their stories. And to hear you like go back to those people and be like, hey, this is going to come to light. We had this raw conversation, a long conversation, very detailed several years ago, but now it's coming back. And so the fact that you're showing that degree of understanding and empathy and with them, I think that just goes to you as a person, but also as a really like maybe like a really like a tender-hearted nonfiction storyteller, where it's just like you're not just this well of information for my own gain. Like you're a person, and I want to honor your stories, and it's really cool to hear you say that.
There's been a lot of talk about empathy, I think, over the past few years, and in the context of journalism and reportage. But, we are sentient connectors, and the more open we are to the feelings, the needs, the experience of others, the richer it makes our lives, but also the more connected we feel. And when I'm talking to someone, I just sort of intuitively feel my heart going out to them. It's not a conscious thing. It's not like, well, this is how I was taught to have a bedside manner, and It's more just who I am naturally, kind of operating in a structured way in the form of an interview. But I think, it really is an asset to be emotionally open and available and have access to your own emotions. And honestly, Brendan, as I was writing this book and I would go back through some of these interviews, I would really just start tearing up as I was getting into some of these intense parts, because I was thinking, my God, these people, they went through that, and it was really hard to imagine them suffering like that. And then also just my relief that they survived. Like, my God, they're still around. They get to be with their kids and they get to rebuild and they get another crack, at life, that was so nearly taken from them. And not all of them made it. We lost some people, in that book. But it's there's a real relief and kind of vicarious happiness that they gutted it out and made it through intact. So that's it feels like a victory kind of for the human race.
Yeah. Yeah, and up the Mackenzie River here, east of Eugene, in 2020 in September over Labor Day, there was the Holiday Farm Fire. It was a giant fire. It laid siege to a lot of houses, and giant tree farm just went up.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard of it. And it gets to the idea of WUI, the wildland urban interface, and all these houses going down, and a lot of people want to rebuild up in that area, but this is the risk you run when you build into a fire ecology. And it was really illuminating to read what you were writing about, WUIs, and the fact is, like, you're almost asking for this to happen to a community if you build into these ecologies like this.
Well, it's almost like having a deer farm, in mountain lion country.
Yeah.
And, they're going to eventually jump the fence or find a way in and kill your deer. And we've grown up in a really unusual time in history when, never besides this past century have we had such an illusion of control over nature. And there's so much of it we've been able to quote unquote manage, including fire suppression, and which really achieved incredible heights after World War II, as I'm sure you know. And we're kind of paying the price for that, by stifling fire, by stifling these natural impulses and these natural purges that forests require, especially in the West. We're really, creating a hazard for the future. And, it's not the sole cause, but, one of the reasons, 21st century fire, as I call it, burns as intensely as it does is because there's this incredible fuel buildup. And, when that goes, it goes off, with an intensity that a normal, quote unquote, healthy fire on a landscape that had been burned over regularly wouldn't achieve. And so, we've really created this problem for ourselves, and hand in hand with that elevated fire suppression ability has been this idea that, well, we can live anywhere and we'll be safe. And no people stopped living in the forest in the 19th century, really, partly because they got burned out so often. And if you look at many settlements around Europe and traditional settlements in the east coast of the US, historically they were broad fields all the way around the community. And some of that was for ease of pasturage and planting, but also it made an incredible natural fire break. And so the forest could burn all it wanted to, but when you've got, hundreds of acres of fields all the way around your village, you'll be protected. And they learned that the hard way. And Stephen Pine, really the eminence grise of American and really global fire, and an amazing writer and historian. He writes about that really eloquently, describing watching these communities burn, these WUI communities burn down. He said it's like watching polio or cholera come back. We already figured out how to vaccinate for it, how to cure it. And it's like we forgot the lesson. And as people moved into the WUI, as they really started to do, combining with the explosion of suburbia and then this more recent desire to live close to nature and have, running trails out the back door and a cul-de-sac out front, we really forgot that no, actually forests, especially in the West, are extraordinarily flammable, and this is a part of their normal life cycle. And now you've put this permanent and really quite volatile structure that's worth a lot of money and takes a lot to insure right in the middle of it. And so you're really kind of asking for it. And now I think with the elevated temperatures due to climate change and the drying that goes hand in hand with elevated temperatures, we've now ratcheted up the flammability of those WUI communities in a way that really wasn't the case, say, in 1990.
You brought up World War II a moment ago, also, about fire suppression and stuff of that nature. And there's a moment in the book where you're looking to a fire expert to kind of describe what was going on with Fort McMurray, and he brought up the Hamburg firestorm and the fire bombing of Hamburg by the Allies over in Germany in World War II. And I was hoping maybe you could speak to that and the hunt you went on to try to draw that corollary, which you did so well.
Well, it was such a surprise. I mean, there was so much about this again is one of, joy is kind of the wrong word in this context, but one of just the really surprising and energizing aspects of being a researcher and a reporter.
And the discovery of it, right?
The discovery of things that you literally cannot imagine. And one of those was, as I spoke to firefighters, one of them casually said, yeah, it took about 5 minutes for these houses to burn down. And I'm, like, did I hear you right? This is a 2-story house, that up in Fort McMurray, they run about, between $500,000 and $800,000 a piece up there. These are brand new homes, state of the art. It's a very, very wealthy community. And in 2016, when I was first researching up there, the median household income was $200,000 a year. A very, very wealthy petroleum town. And so the houses reflect that. And these houses were burning down in 5 minutes. And it just didn't sound physically possible. And I kind of pushed back on this firefighter, and he said, yeah, I know it sounds impossible, but that's what was happening. And so I said, okay, I'll take that with a grain of salt. And then I interviewed some other firefighters who were in different parts of the city, in different neighborhoods that also burnt to the ground. And they said, yeah, that was about 5 minutes. And so, I'm trying to wrap my head around this because a house weighs about 50 tons. It's full of a lot of stuff. And just think of how long it takes to burn a 2x4. You don't burn a 2x4 in 5 minutes. It takes half an hour to burn a 2x4, even under the best circumstances. So what is going on there? So I wrote to Vito Bobrowskis. I was looking at, Googling around for, house flammability and domestic fire, and came across this guy, Vito Bobrowskis, who's based in Seattle. And he's kind of the go-to guy for structure and household goods flammability. And he's, written a couple hundred articles and some really big books, textbooks and things like that. So I wrote to him, and I said, these houses were burning down in 5 minutes, and he was aware of the Fort McMurray fire. And I said, how is this physically possible? What's going on to make them volatilize that quickly? So imagine throwing a milk carton into a bonfire. That's how the houses were going up. And he wrote back, really surprisingly quickly. And he said, yeah, that's a tough one, but the Hamburg firestorm is a good place to start. And the idea of an intentionally set urban fire that was initiated by hundreds of Allied fighter bombers dropping literally thousands upon thousands of tons of thermite incendiary bombs onto the homes of the workers of Hamburg, Germany in the summer of 1943. I just never would have occurred to me to use that example as a way to understand what happened in Fort McMurray. And I started reading about that firestorm, which was intentionally set, so to the point that Allies, Americans, hired German architects to recreate exactly German workers' houses in the Hammerbrook neighborhood of Hamburg, and they built these in Utah on a bombing range, and they bombed them over and over again to get, figure out what was the right combination of thermite to get these things to really go up. And they were intentionally trying to start a firestorm, and they succeeded. They did it on a really hot day after a period of minimal rain, and the firestorm of Hamburg, is legendary, and it created, cyclonic winds, and human beings were sucked into it, and the streets melted, and fire trucks burst into flame, hundreds of meters from open fire just because of the radiant heat. It was absolutely apocalyptic and totally man-made. And so, as I was trying to wrap my head around the horror of that, and then think about Fort McMurray, which was, it was another working town, but it was a wildfire that came into the city. So what's the similarity? And then I started realizing, well, actually, a black spruce tree heated to 1,000 degrees is a lot like a firebomb. These are very flammable trees that are actually designed to burn. The boreal forest system in northern Canada, all the way around the northern hemisphere, is a fire dependent system that regenerates itself through periodic fire. So black spruce is one of those keystone species that responds to fire with great exuberance. So firefighters literally call it gas on a stick. So imagine drought conditions around the city of Fort McMurray. Imagine a relative humidity of 11%, which is comparable to Death Valley, which is 2,000 miles south of Fort McMurray. Imagine temperatures of 90 degrees, which is almost 30 degrees above normal for that time, that period in May in the subarctic. And then in introducing a wildfire to those conditions, you get these explosive circumstances that when they come into a modern neighborhood, we discover that the modern house is actually filled with petroleum products. So, in a way, between the black spruce and the petroleum infused houses, vinyl siding, tar shingles, all the laminates and glues that go into plywood and flooring, and then think of all the polyurethane and the synthetic stuffing in the upholstery, all that stuff volatilizes certainly at 1,000 degrees, and it doesn't catch on fire, it explodes into flame simultaneously. So, in a sense, the city firebombed itself
Mm.
between the black spruce trees and the heavy petroleum content in every home. It was perfectly designed to explode into flame. And that's not what we think about when we think about building a house, moving into a house, raising our children in a house. We don't think about them as potential fire bombs, but you get them hot enough. And that's what 21st century fire is capable of doing. It totally changes the nature of what your shelter is. And it's really a mind bender. I've had to spend a lot of time with that just to think of, what a home can become under extreme circumstances.
In the same way that someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I wonder for you, like now that you know so much about fire, how has just the nature of our world and just what you know about fire, like how do you now see the world around you? How has your view of the world around you changed based on what you know about fire behavior and fire weather?
The world is a much more volatile place now through my lens.
Yeah.
And I look at, where I live here in Vancouver. I live in a very thickly settled neighborhood of 100-year-old wooden houses. They're basically great big boxes of kindling. And if we had another heat dome like we did in 2021, we were pushing 100 degrees here, which is insane for Vancouver, British Columbia. You add a stiff wind and some kind of fire accident, you could lose the whole west side of the city. And I'd never really thought about that before, but wooden cities have burnt down in the past, and with the extreme heat that is now much more common, fire likes that, and fire's energized by that. And so that is a real concern to me. And then the other piece of this is going back to the petroleum industry. The petroleum industry is a fire industry. The only reason we're interested in fossil fuels, whether it's coal or natural gas or bitumen or oil, is because it burns. And so we talk about the energy industry or the oil and gas industry, but what we're really talking about is a fire industry. And we are surrounded every day by thousands of fires. Whether it's in the cars around us, in our pilot lights, in our stove and our water heaters. Fire is part and parcel of our civilization. But with every one of those fires comes emissions, and when you multiply that times billions, which is what we're dealing with now, you're really going to impact the container that is our atmosphere. It's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in our atmosphere stays in our atmosphere. And what's happening in our atmosphere right now is that vast quantities of CO2 and methane are being emitted into it and creating the conditions for a much warmer climate and a much more combustible climate. And so we're living in a more fire prone world now. And so that's something I think about every day.
Damn. Well, the book's incredible, John. I really ate it up. I loved it and just learned a lot, and then just was also just amazed at your capacity to build scenes too, which I think was a masterclass in that, which is a ton of fun to read, and also just as someone who admires that kind of thing, I was like, wow, this is handled well and in the hands of someone who's truly skilled. So as we bring this conversation down for a landing, I always like to ask a guest for a recommendation of some kind, and that's just anything you could be excited about these days. So I'd pose that to you, John. Like, what are you excited about, and what might you recommend for the listeners out there?
Oh boy. Well, thank you, Brendan, for your really kind words and just for your time and interest. I really appreciate it. It's really fun to talk about this and with a fellow practitioner. So I really appreciate that. And as far as I think Timothy Egan is a guy I have a lot of time for, and who I really admire, and just a fantastic American nonfictioneer and historian. And if you haven't read The Worst Hard Time or seen the documentary film of that name that he made with Ken Burns, I really urge you to watch it or read it, because it captures in microcosm an environmental breakdown, a climate breakdown, totally driven by capitalism and short-sighted greed, with a clarity and succinctness and vividness that is, again, speaking of master classes and masters, it just really is a beautiful example. And if I was in charge of education, I would have every 11th grader on the continent read that book or watch that documentary. And another one like that for me that really, I think, honestly sort of set me on the path that I'm on now is David McCulloch's early work, The Johnstown Flood, about the famous flood that washed away that Pennsylvania town, I think in 1889. It was really the worst disaster on American soil, and that record stood. I think it may still stand. A couple of thousand people died. In terms of I think it was not until maybe the Galveston flood, was that number surpassed. But the way he describes all the contributing factors, it was a completely man-made environmental disaster that was completely avoidable. And he just, without wagging fingers or being judgmental, he just kind of lays out the conditions and lays out the human foibles that led to this catastrophe. And I just find that so interesting. And, both those books are kind of parables for our current situation around climate and petroleum and just the conflict between the limits of the natural world and our own appetites, and what we are being persuaded to buy, and how much we're being persuaded to use every day. And so that I just feel like those are really timely and kind of eternal, evergreen books and stories that continue to resonate for me.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, John, like, thanks so much for the work you've done in this incredible book. And again, thanks for carving out time to come on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Brendan. Power to you, and I'll be listening.
Nice. Thanks to John. He's at John Vaillant on Twitter. Remember, it's pronounced Valiant, but it's spelled not like Valiant. Vaillant. He's at johnvaillant.com, but it's a website under construction, so just go to Twitter, okay? And name of the book again is Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world. Don't forget to rage against the algorithm with me over at Substack. I've pulled away from Twitter, way the fuck back from Twitter. I logged out. The coward's Twitter deletion. I hang on to it because I'm a cowardly invertebrate, which is another way of saying I'm a coward. But also, sometimes Twitter comes in handy to find people. That's what I tell myself. Been enjoying being logged out of Twitter and playing with notes over on Substack. To me, it feels like what Twitter used to be around 2009, 2010. And it's such a writer-reader-centric ecosystem, naturally. And so it just feels more wholesome, if something like that can feel wholesome. So the writing and the research. I should say, parting shot here. The writing and the research are rowing in the same boat together. The research is in the bow, saying I'm king of the world, and writing is in the back, shoveling fucking coal into the furnace, saying fuck you. Now I have to make sense of all your bullshit, motherfucker. And the research has a telescope saying, like, look over there, what beautiful land. And the writing in the back is planning a mutiny. He's like, keep talking, you bitch. To quote Kurt Vonnegut, my hero, he said, when I write, I feel like an armless, legless man with a crayon in his mouth. My God, an adult crayon at best. I had a double goose egg this past weekend, writing-wise, which meant I needed to, for those who are unfamiliar with the goose egg term, numerical terms, it's a 0, and I had a back-to-back 0 day, Saturday, Sunday, just wasn't motivated. I usually can blame that on being hungover, but I wasn't even that. So I knew that starting the week, I needed back-to-back 500-word days to get my average back up to 285 per day. That's not a scenario you want to repeat very often. Seeing that daily average drop is terrifying. I was at 278, so not on pace exactly. Then I had that my first 0 day, and it dropped to 264 average. Ugh. And then another 0 on Sunday dropped it to 251. And now we're starting to panic. Now things are getting weird. And that's when I needed to string back-to-back 5 hondos. I was like, what happens if I do 500 Monday, 500 Tuesday? Okay, that gets me back on track. So I did 534 on Monday, got the average back up to 264. 447 the next day, averaged up to 272. Shit. And then 659 on Wednesday, and the average is back up to 288 and back on pace. As of yet, today, at this recording, I have done 0, and I'm not hopeful about a 285-word day. So if I type in 0, type, that drops the average down to 277. Okay, it's just 8 words shy of average. Not bad. At least it's not going to crater the process. I have a leak in one of my gutters, and during the rainy season, I let it drip, and I place a protein canister under it. And sure enough, after a few solid days of Oregon rain in the month of, let's say, February, the can fills up, and I can water plants with it. For my temperament and my relative privilege, the drip-by-drip way of writing really works for me. For now, I can afford to do that with the time I have and the leash I've been granted. For others, binge writing and turning the spigot on full blast is their practice, and that's fine. There's no one way to do it, which is why I bristle at, quote, like advice in podcasts, because the case study is always what worked for that person. If you just have like a passing curiosity about how people work, fine. That's great. Frankly, the best person to ask for advice is a past version of yourself. Trial and error, scientific method, see what works. And more importantly, what's repeatable? Because that's the only way you'll finish anything. There's an epidemic of unfinished projects. But it's tricky because sometimes hearing about a writer's approach might give you a spark. Like, oh, maybe I'll try that. I like to say, like, add to cart. You just throw that in the cart and free 2-day shipping, and you can apply whatever you want. But really what it boils down to, and this is more or less a quote from Austin Kleon, people want to be writers, but they don't want to write. Fall in love with writing, and then you'll become a writer. This is what he really says. He said, forget the noun, do the verb. Kleon writes in the book, Keep Going. It's the whole Stephen King pencil trope, like using, if you went up to Stephen King, well, what pencil do you use? Thinking that that's going to channel the energy. Using the same pencil as King is not going to make you king. So stop looking for a shortcut or a hack or a wormhole to get you to the other side of Saturn. Experiment, play, maybe hire a coach, wink, wink. Listening to others talk about creativity is fine. I do it, I love it. You do it, you love it, presumably. But it's no substitute for confronting the fucking dungeon boss on your own and realizing you had all the power you ever needed in the first place. Use the Force, Luke. Stay wild, CNFers. If you can do, interview. See ya.